It wasn't going after me, at least not yet. My feet kicked and I found my arms latching onto the wall of green mossy stuff. I climbed up, pulling myself foot by foot towards the surface. I was flying blind, having no idea where I was or what was going on because the water hurt my eyes too much to keep them open. The thrashing above was now behind me, and I was safe for the moment. I didn't know how fast it would take care of Bonnie, nor did I want to pause to give it enough time. My chest was already starting to squeeze, and the pressure on my brain was kicking me further and further into a fight or flight. I'd wasted too much time floating down there. Now my lungs were ready to implode. There wasn't any rhythm to my mad stabs at the wall, but my repeated frantic handfuls of empty water pulling me up and over, each lurching heartbeat that slammed into my ears like a sledgehammer told me how stupid I was to waste that time. But then my hand shot again into that dark green soup, instead feeling the matted, soaked chill of open air. My head and shoulders followed right after, a torrent of that stuff splashing into the dark as I took a huge, desperate breath. My voice echoed off the walls of the room around me, coming back in distorted, nauseated screams. I scrambled with both arms towards the direction opposite the intense tornado of tangled moans and crying behind me, feeling my hands slam into the concrete edge of the pool. I wasted no time in lunging up, my ribs barreling into the tile, and bruising while I slung each leg onto the solid ground, the cold air around already cutting into my skin. I laid in a puddle on the ground, not far from when I had started before. I could feel my hand resting on the shoulder of my invisible friend, whose chest pulled in and pushed out steadily, and I was happy for that. It was us alone in there, with Barnabas's howling in the water. I'd been at the bottom so long that he was almost gone when I'd swam up. Now that I could hear him properly, there was only the occasional splash, his hand or leg painting the water, kicking at the thing that was digesting his body. But the screaming, it didn't stop. It only died down real slowly. Even as his throat got tired and he was well stuck in the tarry feelers of the blanket, a raspy whimper would bleed out. Under his noises came the squelching hiccups, probably the skin of the thing pulling at Barnabas's flesh, taking the best bits. If I'm being a bit dark here, it's because I want to be. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel safer now that the creep was gone, but it didn't change the fact that I was the one who'd done it. Asshole or not, I killed him, Conrad. Thinking about the weight of that kind of thing, I don't know. It makes me think that way, all black and drab. But it feels right to write it out like this on page. Like I can get some of that feeling out of me, but handing it off to you, if you don't mind. It would be unfair for me to take all of this on my own plate. It'd be nice to unload some of it on someone else. I don't think there's enough of Barney to bury. The last I saw, in what light I had before what happened next, there was a faint visage of a single hand drifting across the surface in a small raft of debris. In the dark, it shone like a vaguely glowing cartoon ghost. I looked over the edge when he'd finally gone quiet, and seen it there riding the waves of Barney's last splash, doing a lap around the edge of the pool like a Renaissance jouster would have done with his opponent's head. In the dark, while I watched the fingers of Barney's severed hand dance in ripples, I felt someone else's drift against mine, inspecting my fingers before wrapping around them slowly. My invisible friend finally spoke to me, in a silly little whisper, bookended with a nasty cough that sounded like it hurt. "What happened?" I didn't reply, refusing to take my attention away from the pit, knowing that the blanket would probably lick around the edge, looking for another bite. My body was basically emptied, now soaked to the bone with the nastiest water in the world. I laid on the hard tile floor with a random injured person 2 feet away. Someone was dead, someone was hurt, and someone was still back at the rec center, waiting to see both Barnabas and I walking out of the poolhouse. Someone who knew what was in the bag. Someone who used me to get rid of that dirty little secret. Someone I'd practically known since I was born. And he was just a few yards away, feeling the gust of the new air conditioner in his office, pushing a needle 4 or 5 inches into his arm and just slipping off somewhere in his head. Someone, I guess, who was likely going to venture on down here when he didn't hear or see his truck pull back into the parking lot. There was no way I could get out of this one, not with my own lungs hardly being able to keep up. I felt my friend's arm wrap around me, clinging to my side as they dragged their body across the floor. A ball of hair laid against my chest, and I heard the tiny breaths pull in and out. Jedediah? I knew the voice, but it took me a second in my confusion to pull out a face from my brain. It was a soft voice, almost like a girl's. It was Darby. It was Darby all along, limply tossing around in that duffel bag. Even as I struggled for breath and felt the heat of my skin against the soaking sheath of my clothes, a nasty picture was painted in my head. I thought about Vinnie and Barnabas, what I'd heard in his office spoken between them like a plan out of hell. Vince had asked Barney for something which Barney could supply, but Barnabas wanted something for it, and he'd said Vinnie was low on cash. These fucking monsters. The whole goddamn troop of them, with their business and trades, and they had traded, didn't they? You're not such a bookworm that you'd not get the general idea. Thinking about it now, I feel disgusted even to have stood next to these guys. If I'd known, maybe I could have done something. I could have maybe saved Darby from all of this. But this isn't a comic book. I wasn't Superman in this whole story. You know, Conrad, I don't think there is a Superman. Not in stories like this. Not in stories like mine. Just my luck, huh? Even when I decided to make my own way, my own movie with my own plots and goals in life, I still can't get it together. Stuck in this town with Draculas all around me. I'm still just trying to clean up the nightmares they make. But in the moment, his head on my shoulder, I didn't think of any of this. Instead, I wrapped my hand around his and tried to offer him whatever warmth I had left. We laid that way in the dark for a while, maybe half an hour before I heard something from just outside those giant windows. It was a stream of footsteps, crunching into the snow, making their way closer and closer to the poolhouse. He'd be coming in soon, I thought. He'd come in and he'd see what had happened, and we'd end up with hell to pay. What would he do? There was no telling now what Vince would be capable of. He wasn't somebody I knew anymore. We weren't the same people that we had been when it was just you, me, and him running around, being good old towny kids. He didn't even see us as his friends anymore, of that I'm positive. When was the last time my cousin had asked how I was, or visited the house to check up on me and Mimi? No, ever since he'd gotten back home, he'd made it clear that we weren't the same anymore. Whatever had happened when he'd gone to uni, however he saw himself now, that was all there was. The man who stood at the door of the pool house and shoved himself inside now, I didn't know what he'd do. I heard him step into the hallway, dragging his feet along the dirt-covered floor. His steps were wild, like he was dancing to a song only he could hear. He'd stop every few seconds, adjusting himself before walking along. Barnabas? Barney, you lounge cat, what are you up to? His voice was strange and stuttery, slurring at the end of his words. I realized then that Vince was riding that tiger at the moment. He was bathed in some dreamy state of mind, probably not even sure where he was. There was a metallic click somewhere near him, and I heard him lightly smack something against his hand. A beam of a light shot into the dark above us, cutting into the misty air. I saw flies buzzing around in circles, dancing in and out of the beam as Vince drunkenly swung his flashlight around the room. When he'd spoke, Darby's fingers squeezed mine, and I heard him gasp at the realization of who was in there with us. The shock in his noises, the way he shivered against me. This pit grew in my brain as if I felt how scared he was. I was beyond angry. The genuine hate that filled me was something else. But if I was planning to jump up and be my own little Superman, the time to do it had passed. My chest hurt, my arms and legs were shot. There was nothing left in me to fight with, to confront Vince with. I was a sack of meat and bones. No choice to do anything left in me at all. So I sat in my puddle of muck, listening to the steps steadily close in on me and Darby. The crunching pine needles drew close to my head, and I felt the warmth of the flashlight finally fall on my face.
Vaughn. Oh, Jesus. God fucking Jesus.
Vince's steps slid away, his breath diving into his chest with a huge gasp.
What are we gonna...
He slurred and sputtered, coming back to his voice with whatever effort he could shoot up from his addled brain.
Bonnie! Oh, anyone? Little Jetty's down, guys. Little Jetty.
Some muck from inside of him got caught in his throat, and I heard him hock it out, the spit landing somewhere close to my face. I wanted to light him up, Conrad. Every fiber of hate and fire in me was begging me to get up, to launch a 5-finger A-bomb into his gut and lay him out on the poolhouse floor. But all those little signals firing off in my brain didn't add up to much. What I could do was manage to hoist myself up with my arms. My legs were concrete, but I slung my shoulders into the air and clung to my knees, catching myself before I fell. My cousin shit himself when he caught sight of me, leaning back against his ankles in shock.
Oh man, Jetty, you're up and you gotta understand, pal, buddy. This is all just a big misunderstanding.
But that was all he got out. Maybe it was the piles of debris on the floor, but his broken brain couldn't have helped much. He slept, and I stared up at the light as it flew from his hand and bounced off the tile at his feet. He went slack on the floor, landing in a sickening, meaty plop. He'd gasped as he caught air, and sealed his surprise with a disgusting crunch sound as his head pounded against the ground. I felt Darby's body lift and lean against my shoulder, his hair bouncing against my chin as he looked on with me. The silver arm of the flashlight rolled lazily in the dark, softly stopping against my hip. I wasn't in a hurry, but I grabbed it and waved it towards the hunkered shape of my cousin on the floor. His massive, muscly frame was piled together in a sweaty, well-dressed heap. His black leather jacket was spilled over his torso like a blanket, and I saw his face, grimaced and plated against the tile. The whites of his eyes showed beneath his twitching eyelids, and his lips were drawn back, slobber water falling down from his tongue. Darby and I watched a dark red stream of blood pool out from beneath this curtain of dried black hair. Neither of us moved at first. How were we going to help? Why would we help? Am I a monster too, Conrad? What am I after doing what I did? If you think I have given you the worst, you have no idea how bad this really is. I need you to know, I had no idea what to do. I don't want to lose you as my friend, but you have to know the truth. It's tearing me apart, Conrad. Between all these monsters and their business, I'm stuck wondering if I'm no different. I spent every day of my life here in this town. All the time hanging out with you and Vinnie. You two were practically my parents, for fuck's sake. Without Mom and Dad, it was always just you two. But now I'm not a kid anymore and you're long gone. I looked at that disgusting pile of poisoned meat on the ground, and it didn't even look like my Vince anymore. The things he'd done, the people he was hurting, all under my nose. My Vince was dead. And he was dead a lot longer than even I knew. All that was left now was me, and whatever was left of my cousin. And instead of grabbing him, instead of getting up and phoning the police, I just stared at the light reflecting off the ocean of blood, steadily crawling towards me. And the slope of the tile coaxed the rim of the blood into a stream, and it flowed faster down the grade, slipping over the edge of the pool. The beam of the light followed it, and I knew what would happen next. There was a bubbling in there, a pot set to cook. Then the slick, mucusy slapping breached the surface. The blanket was here, and it was hungry again. The black folds of its surface were barely visible in the light, but I could still make out its lips lapping at the tile, licking at the crimson milk that flowed right into its mouth. Did Darby see it? I don't know. We haven't talked about it, and I don't know if we ever really will. I don't know how I'd live with myself pushing the weight of that thing onto someone else. But if he did see it, he didn't tell me. He didn't scream or curse, so it's up in the air. But what he did do is stand up. Darby stumbled up from the ground, catching his weight on my shoulder as to not fall. It surprised me, and I moved to grab his hand to stop him, but he didn't notice me at all. He just steadied himself and took a step away. I turned the light on him, just to see where he was going. That's when I saw the state of him. He was practically naked. I mean, no shirt, no pants at all. He was down to his underwear, showing all the snow-white skin underneath. They were ripped, and the cloth below the waistline slung down his thigh in ribbons. A dried red streak drew down from beneath his underwear and made a course down his thigh and calf. His pale back was littered with bulbous purple bruises. I felt my heart stop when I saw them trail along right across his shoulder and spine. The back of his neck was collared with a dark red crown, and the patchy shapes of fingers still printed around it. The sight of him shook me up so fast that I had to bounce back to some other thought. Anything other than what I'd seen and what it implied. I thought about Mimi. I thought about home, I thought about school, and I thought about you, Conrad. I had to close out that evil nastiness trying to paint a picture in my head that I didn't want to see. So I thought of everything nice that I could. Darby took no notice of me or the flashlight, and I saw his steps draw nearer to Vince. His bare foot planted wetly into the puddle of blood, but Darby didn't seem to care. He stood there, standing over Vinnie and breathing heavily. At first you think it was silent before hearing the soft, implosive whimpers under Darby's breath. I realized he was crying, and I closed my eyes to give him whatever privacy I could imagine. He stood there and cried, but not for long. He stopped before I heard him wrap a hand around Vince's ankle. I didn't open my eyes. I knew just as well as if I had seen it. Darby struggled to get both of Vince's ankles in each hand. He's a smaller fella, more of a shrimp than a varsity athlete, but I didn't imagine his progress as much as I heard him give the first tug on Vinnie's body. It drew heavy on the tile, and even through his raspy, tired breaths, Darby committed. The sounds of Vince's cheek squeaking against the floor would fill the room, stopping every once in a while so that Darby could draw another breath. When I did open my eyes, it was to make sure that Darby was careful to keep from the edge, while he did what he was going to do. I knew, Conrad. I'm not stupid. I could give a guess as to what Darby's goal was. That's where my big problem comes in, because that's where I let it all go. I didn't move to stop Darby, even knowing what was going to happen as soon as skin touched water. Darby didn't know what he was doing, I think. The things that had happened to him that night, I can't imagine that he'd been in the right frame of mind for a long, long time. He was just a kid, doing what I think anyone would do, having been through what he had. Even if I was a saint, even if it was my own cousin being dragged into that soup, I don't think it's my place to tell anyone what's right. Darby was owed something, I think. That's all. What was he gonna do? Tell the police? You think a town like this is gonna dawn a trial like that? No, I don't think so. Good old boys don't see time for things like that. Not when it hurts to even look at things they'd done. Weinwick is a hole, and whatever Darby would try to bring light to, likely would sink down deep. So I let him, Conrad. When I heard Vince's shoes splash and Darby shove Vince's upper body over the edge, I sat there and let it happen. I like to think that when Darby sat back down next to me, holding his head between his knees, that he didn't hear the noises. But he had to, because the pathetic, waking groans of Vince's brain coming to the water were too sickening to ignore. It got even worse as his hand slapped around, trying to find purchase somewhere to keep himself afloat. Then the blanket came out of the dark, and the other side of the pool let a nearly silent wave creep towards his hollering. There was one scream, that's all. It was bright and loud like a bomb siren, and then it was drowned, buried under gallons of liquid as that thing pulled his head under the waves. Oh, there was thrashing in the dark. Long blades of water streamed across my face from his struggle. Little echoes of his voice would poke through the torrent of crashing water, but none could be interpreted as words. Not in reality, at least. In my head, though, they were all melting down to the same few syllables over and over. Jeddy, Jeddy, Jeddy. I didn't move. Jeddy, please, help me, Jeddy. I couldn't block out the thoughts. Jed, remember how we were back in the day? Remember the baseballs, the movies, the games? It wasn't even pretending to be real anymore. It was a ghost in my ear, and I pictured it all with Vince's face, teeth baring and eyes glowing like red-hot coals.
Family, Jeddy. It's all about the goddamn family. Be a man, you spineless sack of shit. Be a goddamn Clint Eastwood, all-American man.
I didn't say anything to it. I'm not one to sit and talk to myself. Instead, this fat frog jumped into my throat and I felt the waterworks start up in the creases of my eyes. In the dark, it was me and Darby till daylight. I felt his face press wetly into my shoulder, as I'm sure he felt my tears fall gently into his hair. Darby fell asleep soon after the sound slipped away into silence. But me, I was stuck awake. I guess there was no rest to be had with me, not even with how broken I felt. After all, I had one more job to do. Even if Vince and Barney were gone, the blanket was still in there, floating around somewhere in the dark. I was no longer terrified now, though. After all that had happened, how could I be? I used up all my fear, I guess. Instead, there was this nagging thought in my head, reminding me what I'd come here to do in the first place. So, when Darby's breaths got deeper and I was sure he'd fallen asleep, I stood up. I stretched a little, feeling the aches of my wounds and bruises swell up in gradual pain, and then I just stepped towards the door. It was miserable outside. A giant orange sea of clouds was lit up, dropping heavy snow. I felt the cold attack my soaked clothing, but I still kept walking. I kept walking till I'd almost felt like I could walk no more. But I got into the golf cart, and I drove down the field and over to the pool house. I dragged each bucket of chlorine tablets inside and popped the lid off each before kicking them over. The surface of the water erupted in a giant hiss, seeds of bubbles growing from where the chlorine had met the water. Great big yelps of air shot up from the water as the air inside the buckets evacuated. A growing circle of white foam stretched out from the middle of the pool, viciously scraping against the edges as I met them. The steam grew thicker over the water, and that chemical smell wasted no time in filling the room. The surface writhed, and I saw its black flaps jerk around in the waves. I guess the chlorine was too strong at the bottom, so it had come to relieve itself from the chemicals. But I knew it wouldn't be long. No way in hell. The amount of that stuff I'd poured in could clear a lake, let alone burn the pool until nothing could live inside. It struggled silently, and I watched. I'd like to think that if it had a mouth, it'd be screaming. It was in pain. That was the best part. That meant it could feel, that it could die. When I called the police department, it had to be past 6 in the morning. I wasn't going to have a big speech or anything. I just asked that they come to the pool house with the ambulance again, and that there had been bad things at the pool house that morning. That was it. That was my nightmare tied up in a big blood-soaked ribbon. Sitting there next to Darby, watching the sun come up behind those giant glass windows, I wondered if this was my movie. If this was my whole story, just like I'd wanted. Wouldn't it be just my luck that my own story would last a week and a half? That'd be filled with monsters and bastards, that I wouldn't even get to be my own hero. Just my luck, sure. But now that I'm home, and that the worst has passed, I know it's not. It can't be, or at least I won't let it be. Some stories start badly. It happens all the time. You don't get a fair shake sometimes, that's just the way it goes. But now, I get to really take hold, you know? From now on, it's my show. I don't know what I'll do. I can't decide yet. But I won't die in this town. Just like I didn't die in that evil shack. Me and Mimi are gonna go somewhere. Somewhere far and somewhere that feels right. University or 9 to 5, I don't care. But it'll be my choice. And that means it'll be the right one. I'm no one's doughboy anymore, that's clear enough. But I can't leave just yet. There's still some time I need to put in. I need cash, and I need a diploma. And more than that, I need to make sure that Darby's okay. I feel like I owe it to him, I guess. All he's been through, that little window into my life sent him into hell, and he deserves someone to talk to. Tomorrow I'll jog down to the school and see if I can get his mailing address. I don't think he'll be in the visiting mood for a bit, but I can still write to him. Here's to hoping he doesn't remember everything that happened to us in that nightmare last night. But if he does, I'll make sure he's able to deal with it. What are friends for? Wish me luck, Dopey. I'll see you around. Jed.